This is lecture number 23 of Pakistan Studies. The topic is the political history of Pakistan 72 to the present. This lecture will be divided into 5 parts. The first part will deal with the period 1972-77. The second part 1977 to 1985. The third part 1985 to 1999. The fourth part 1999 to 2002. The last and the fifth part would be 2002 and onwards. The first part, 1972-1977, actually begins on December 20th, 1971, when General Yahya Khan resigned and handed over power to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who assumed presidency. As there was no constitution at that time, he also continued with the post of Chief Martial Law Administrator, although he was a civilian. The first task undertaken by this government, or that is to say, during the first phase, 1972 to 1977, was constitution making. That is the making of the interim constitution, which was enforced in April 1972. Then the making of the 1973 constitution. We have discussed these things in one of our earlier lecture, and you could consult that to see the efforts and the stages through which the National Assembly had to go through to frame first the interim constitution and then the 1973 constitution. Other important policy measure was nationalization. In the early 70s, nationalization was a very popular theme with the political leaders in the developing countries. In the name of social justice, in the name of socialism, promotion of equality, not only in Pakistan but also in a large number of other countries, some kind of nationalization was adopted as a political and economic strategy. In case of Pakistan, number of steps were taken by the then government to pursue the nationalization objectives, and I will mention some of those steps taken by the then government. One was the nationalization or takeover of the emerald mines in Swat. Second, several key industries which were with the private sector, which were owned by private groups, were taken over by the state of Pakistan under a martial law order. And these industries included iron and steel, basic metals, heavy engineering, heavy electrical, motor vehicles and tractor production, heavy basic chemicals, petrochemicals, cement, gas, and oil refineries. These were the core of Pakistani economy at that time, and these were taken over by the Pakistani state from the private groups that were running until that time. There were other steps taken under the rubric of nationalization. Some of those steps included nationalization of life insurance. Banks were nationalized, all private banks were nationalized in 1974. Nationalization of schools and colleges, which were being run by the private sector. All colleges that were not owned by the state, all schools that were not owned by the state, were taken over by the government in the name of nationalization. A new university ordinance was issued to streamline education at the university level. All managing companies or sub-agencies were also taken over or were abolished. So in this way, the state during these years was able to extend its domain over most of the economy of Pakistan. Other policy measures were a new labor policy, which was designed to extend more rights to the labor than what they had under the Ayub Khan regime. Some economic concessions and other facilities were also extended to the labor under the new labor policy. The government also announced a health policy with very high-sounding goals and objectives, like providing medical facilities, cheap drugs, medicines, and other kind of facilities. If we look at these measures, what we find here is that these reforms ran into difficulties. The reason was that nationalization policy, that was the key policy of that government, shifted the control and management of industry to the state institutions and officials, the bureaucrats. And most of them had no experience of handling the industry. The result was that most of the state-owned industry suffered over the years. And then in the 90s, Pakistan had to gradually remove the state control over a good number of industry and adopted a policy of economic liberalization. The other problem was that some of the objectives were too high-sounding and unrealistic, not taking into account the resources that would be available, and that also created problems in realizing the goals that were set out for these policies, especially nationalization and other steps. The government, the Bhutto government, also introduced administrative reforms. It changed the administrative structure, the civil services administrative system, thereby limiting the autonomy and centrality of the key services in the civil services of Pakistan. These reforms are called the 1973 administrative reforms, some of which continued even in the later period. In 1977, the government decided to hold new elections, the general elections, which were held in March 1977. The opposition maintained that the government was involved in rigging elections in a good number of constituencies. It launched an agitation in protest against what they described as rigging of the general elections and demanded the holding of the new elections. With the passage of time, this movement changed its focus from new election to an Islamic system in Pakistan, Nizam-e-Mustafa, and this became a nationwide movement. The government of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was not able to cope with the pressure generated by this movement. Negotiations were held with the opposition parties. However, a working formula for holding elections and who would hold power during that interim period during the election could not be fully and completely settled. And the agitation practically paralyzed the government. It was under these circumstances that the military, under the leadership of its Chief of Staff, General Zia-ul-Haq, overthrew Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's government and assumed power on July 5th, 1977. This takes us to the second phase of today's lecture. The second phase covers the period 1977-1985. It's the period of military rule under Zia-ul-Haq, who suspended the constitution. This was something different from what was done in 1958 or 1969. On these two occasions, the army chief, while assuming power, had abolished the constitution, but in 1977, constitution was suspended, or to use the term, held in abeyance, and martial law was declared throughout the country. And from July 5th, 1977 to December 30th, 1985, Pakistan was under military rule, under martial law. This was the longest military rule in Pakistan's history. The military government of General Zia-ul-Haq had an agenda to pursue, which developed gradually. Broadly speaking, you could identify three items in that agenda. First, effective administration. Second, Islamization of the state and the society. Third, return of the country to democracy and constitutional rule, because while assuming power, General Zia-ul-Haq had promised, among other things, return to democracy and constitutional rule. The major policies that this government pursued included a promise to hold elections. Initially, the government declared that it would hold elections within 90 days and then transfer power to the elected government. So, deadline of 90 days was given. Subsequently, this goal was changed, and the emphasis focused on accountability of the ousted regime, the previous regime, and of political leaders. So as the elections were not held within 90 days, then accountability became a major objective. In addition to this, they also talked about Islamization. Along with Islamization, there were restrictions imposed on political activities, on political parties, on press. The major policy that the military government pursued was Islamization. Islamization of the state institutions and processes, the legal system, the constitutional system, and Islamization of the society. That is, restructuring or reconstruction of society on the basis of Islamic principles and Islamic values. That was the major objectives for the government. In case of Islamization by the military government of General Zia-ul-Haq, we could talk about three major strategies for achieving the goal of Islamization. One, forging alliances, seeking cooperation of those Islamic political parties that shared the goals of the military government. Second, constitutional and legal changes. Third, changes in the society, introduction of new practices and also certain new principles in the society to Islamize the whole structure. I can give you some examples of Islamization during the period of General Zia-ul-Haq. to show the kind of policies the military government had adopted, or the steps the military government had taken in pursuance of this objective, that is, the objective of Islamization. First, in 1979, Shariat benches were established in the provincial high courts and the Supreme Court. In 1981, a federal Shariat court was established to determine whether a particular law or action is in line with the Islamic principles and values. And this institution of federal Shariat court was later on incorporated in the 1973 Constitution. The other steps included the introduction of Islamic punishments under different laws. I may mention here the punishment like stoning to death, amputation of hands, or lashing were made part of the legal system in Pakistan through different ordinances issued by the military government. However, I may mention that with the exception of lashing, the other punishments were never carried out in Pakistan, although they were on the law books during that period. But lashing and no other Islamic punishment, as I have discussed, were actually implemented. Then we can talk about number of other issues and policies which they adopted with reference to Islamization. For example, interest-free banking, profit or loss sharing banking was gradually introduced during this period, starting in 1981, and then gradually this system was expanded. The institution of zakat was enforced by the state, and zakat used to be compulsorily deducted from saving accounts and other investments. Principle of ushur or agriculture tax was also introduced in 1983 on agriculture produce. Then we can talk about the education policy. The government focused on this so that Islamic principles and Islamic values reflect in the courses which students would be following in school, in colleges, and in the universities. So there was now greater emphasis on these values. The same was the case with the media, especially the state-owned media, where conservative Islamic values were emphasized on radio, on TV, and other state media. And in this way, a lot of other steps were taken to Islamize this society. I can give one more example. Council of Islamic Ideology, that under the 73 Constitution was meant to advise the government on Islamization. This body was restructured to make it more effective and also assigned the job of paying more attention, devoting more time to the Islamization process. So in other words, Islamization became the characteristic feature of the military government under General Zia-ul-Haq. And the overall environment within the Muslim world also helped to pursue such a policy. The resistance of the Islamic groups in Afghanistan against Soviet military intervention, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and an overall resurgence of Islam in the Muslim societies contributed to these trends in Pakistan. In addition to Islamization, which was emphasized as the main goal or main strategy of the military government also embarked on a policy to return the country to democracy. It was a graduated approach, step-by-step approach. First, the system of local government was established in 1979. Then, in December 1984, presidential referendum was held, and Zia-ul-Haq was elected through that referendum as president for the next 5 years. So in this way, he became an elected president through a referendum that was held in December 1984. After the referendum, the military government decided to hold general elections, which were held in the last week of February. These elections were partyless. That is to say, the political parties were not allowed to field their candidates, and the candidates had to contest elections in their individual capacities. After the elections, in March 1985, the military government issued revival of the Constitution order, through which the Constitution was revived. That is to say, the 1973 Constitution was revived after introducing several changes in it. One significant change brought in this Constitution was the enhancement of the powers of the President. In the original 1973 Constitution, the powers of the President were extremely limited. Here, with amendments in 1985 through RCO, or Revival of Constitutional Order of March 1985, the President was given some special powers, and one of such power was the power to dissolve the National Assembly in his discretion, or what is known as Article 58(2)(b). This shifted the balance of power in favor of the President. After this had been done, the civilian Prime Minister was installed by General Zia-ul-Haq, and then civilian governments were installed at the provincial level. So in this way, Pakistan was gradually returning back to the civilian and constitutional system. Then the amendments which the military government had introduced in the Constitution were presented to the newly elected Parliament. The Parliament deliberated on those amendments, changed some of these, and passed these amendments under the title of the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. The original draft of the 8th Amendment was what was the revival of Constitution Order 1985, but through a compromise between government and the Parliament, some things were changed and 8th Amendment came into existence, which brought changes in the Constitution and legitimized all the actions taken by the military government of General Zia-ul-Haq during the last several years, going back to July 5th, 1977. Though the civilian government at the federal level was installed in March 1985, and civilian governments at the provincial level were installed in April 85, martial law was not withdrawn until December 30th, 1985. So on 31st December 1985, Pakistan was again back to civilian constitutional rule with elected governments at the provincial and federal levels. Zia-ul-Haq continued as president as a consequence of the referendum that was held in December 1984, and he also continued as the army chief. And in order to accommodate him as army chief, the constitution was duly amended. Now we move on to the third phase that covers the period 1985 to 1999. This is the period of civilian governments in Pakistan. During this period, Pakistan had 5 governments and 3 prime ministers. The first prime minister under this arrangement during this period, 85 to 99, was Muhammad Khan Janejo, who held his office as prime minister from March 1985 to May 1988. The second prime minister was Benazir Bhutto, who assumed the office of prime minister in November 1988 and continued as prime minister till August 1990. The third prime minister was Nawaz Sharif, who assumed this office in October 1990 and served in this office till July 1993. The fourth prime minister was Benazir Bhutto, which is her second term or tenure as prime minister. So she became prime minister for the second time in October 93 and remained in this office till November 96. The fifth prime minister was Nawaz Sharif, this being his second term, and he served as prime minister from February 97 to October 99. In addition to these prime ministers, there were also interim prime ministers. They were there to hold elections, and naturally they were there for 3 months or little over 3 months. We can mention their names for the sake of information. First interim prime minister during this phase was Ghulam Mustafa Jatoi, who was in office as interim prime minister from August till November 1990, and the 1990 elections were held under his government. Then in 1993, there were two interim prime ministers, Balkh Sher Mazari, who was interim prime minister for April, May. Then another interim prime minister during this period was Dr. Moin Qureshi, who was interim prime minister from July 93 to October 93. His government organized the 93 elections. In November 96, Malik Miraj Khalid was appointed interim prime minister, and his government held the 97 elections, and after the election, the regular prime minister assumed the office. If we look at the performance of these civilian governments, that is the civilian governments under the regular prime ministers, we find that these governments adopted various policies for social and economic uplift or for welfare and betterment of the people. But the impact of these policies designed to improve the quality of life of the ordinary people were compromised because of a number of factors. One factor that greatly undermined these civilian government was that most of these governments, in fact, with the exception of the government that was installed in February 97, all these governments were coalition government. And the government didn't have enough support, enough comfortable support in the National Assembly to pursue its policies with confidence and with surety. The governments were concerned and worried about keeping enough support in the assembly to sustain themselves in power. Another problem that undermined these governments was that the political parties that were supporting or sustaining these governments were also not well organized. These governments also suffered from weaknesses because the political parties were not really strong, stable, effective, having a countrywide effective network of support. So weakness of political parties also reflected on the performance of different governments that came into being. Another factor was that during this period, we also witnessed a lot of confrontation between the government and the opposition. And a democratic system cannot function smoothly unless the government and opposition work together, because both are integral to the functioning of a democratic system. Only government or only opposition cannot make sure that democracy is functioning. And unfortunately, the two sides could not develop a working relationship, a stable relationship, a relationship of cordiality, a relationship of confidence. And that is why the performance of these governments suffered. And the result was that some of the policies which they sincerely introduced could not produce the result. I think another issue was that during these years, there were complaints that some members of the ruling party and the ruling parties were changing with the change of government. There were general complaints that some of the people in power were making use of the state resources in a partisan or personal manner. This undermined the reputation of the governments and their performance. Now we move to the next phase. The phase from 1999 to 2002. This phase, 1999 to 2002, is a period of another military rule in Pakistan. The roots of this military rule can be traced back to the situation that developed during the course of the civilian government and could be traced back to the desire of the civilian government to concentrate more and more power and the effort to remove the army chief while he was out of the country. The military, under the leadership of the army chief, General Pervez Musharraf, assumed power on October 12th, 1999. This time, again, the constitution was suspended or held in abeyance. It wasn't abolished, but it was held in abeyance or suspended. Martial law was not declared in the country. So in this way, the situation is different from earlier three cases where martial law was declared. But in October 1999, martial law was not declared. No military courts were established after the military takeover in October 1999. The press enjoyed freedom and political activity continued during this period. The military government announced its political priorities, certain principles which they identified as the guiding principles or as the main principles on which their policies were to be based. The first political priority of the military government that assumed power on October 12, 1999 was rebuild national confidence and morale. That was the first guiding principle. Second, strengthening of federalism in Pakistan or strengthening of federation in Pakistan, removal of inter-provincial disharmony and discord, that is to bring provinces closer to each other. And the third principle was revival of the economy and restoration of confidence of investors. 4, law and order in the country and dealing with similar issues like dispensation of justice. The 5th principle was depoliticization of the state institutions, and 6, devolution of power, and 7th principle was to introduce a system of accountability which is swift and across board. Keeping in view these principles, the government of General Pervez Musharraf pursued different policies and adopted different measures. Some of the policies included various steps to deal with the problem of poverty and underdevelopment. In addition to this, after September 11, 2001, Pakistan government also played an important role in containing terrorism in Pakistan and outside of Pakistan. It became part of the global effort to control terrorism, and then this role won appreciation at the international level. The most important task before the government was to return the country to the civilian and constitutional rule. And this was done gradually, step by step. This started with the holding of a referendum in April 2002. And before that referendum, the government had already introduced the system of local government. In 2002, the first step was a referendum in April 2002. Then legal framework order was issued, which brought about changes in the constitution. And after LFO, general elections were held on 10th October 2002, and all political parties were allowed to contest. After the general elections, the constitution was revived. President Musharraf took oath of office as elected president, and then civilian governments were restored or established under the constitution at the federal and provincial level. So by the end of year 2000, Pakistan was back to constitutional and civilian rule. Now we move on to the last phase, that is the restoration of civilian government. As I said, by the end of year 2002, Pakistan was back to civilian rule. General Musharraf had become elected president, civilian prime minister, civilian cabinet, civilian chief minister, civilian governments were working at the provincial level, and in this way the promise to return the country to civilian and constitutional rule had been confirmed and implemented. This gives us a hope that with due course of time, the democratic system will consolidate and will become durable. This brings an end to our discussion of Pakistan's political history from 1947 to the present, which was spread over 2 lectures, and we have seen different changes over these years. Khuda Hafiz, until we meet for the next discussion on a topic regarding Pakistan studies.